He thought he could ruin her reputation in a single hearing, but by the end of that morning, the courtroom would witness the quiet collapse of his own power. The courthouse stood tall against the pale morning sky, its marble steps reflecting the early sunlight as people moved in and out with purpose, briefcases in hand, voices low, footsteps echoing across polished floors that had seen decades of verdicts, secrets, and silent injustices, and among them, Emma Lawson walked in alone, her modest navy coat wrapped neatly around her. Her posture calm, but her eyes steady in a way that suggested she understood more than she revealed, because what most people saw was just a simple high school literature teacher summoned to court over what appeared to be a minor legal issue. But what they didn't see was the precision in her gaze, the quiet calculation behind every breath she took as she stepped into a place where she was never meant to win, at least not according to the man who orchestrated it all, Judge Richard Pierce, who sat in his private chamber just beyond the courtroom doors, reviewing a thin file with a faint smile that barely touched. His lips, his polished shoes resting firmly on the hardwood floor, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he replayed the moment Emma had stood up weeks earlier at a public meeting and questioned him, not emotionally, not recklessly, but with calm, structured arguments that exposed inconsistencies in his ruling, and that, more than anything, had unsettled him, because power, in his world, was never meant to be challenged by someone who looked like her, someone who spoke softly, dressed simply, and carried no visible authority. Yet here she was again, walking straight into the trap he had carefully arranged. Unaware, he believed, that every detail of this hearing had been designed to corner her, to discredit her, to make an example out of her in front of an audience that would walk away convinced she had overstepped her place. And as the courtroom doors opened, a quiet murmur rippled through the room as Emma entered. A few heads turning, whispers barely contained as people glanced at her with curiosity, some with skepticism, others with quiet indifference, because in a room like this, appearances spoke louder than truth, and Emma's simple presence did not command attention. Not yet. She moved toward the defense table with measured steps, placing her folder down gently, her fingers resting on its edge for just a moment longer than necessary, as if grounding herself, while across the room, the clerk adjusted papers, the bailiff stood still as stone, and the air itself seemed to tighten in anticipation of what was about to unfold, because this was not just another routine hearing, though it was meant to appear that way. This was a calculated stage, and every person in that room had unknowingly become part of a performance directed by a man who believed he controlled the outcome before it even began. The side door opened, and Judge Pierce entered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned respect, his robe falling perfectly into place as he took his seat, his expression composed, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling, briefly, on Emma. And in that fleeting moment, there was something beneath the surface, something colder than confidence, something that suggested certainty, as if he were looking at a conclusion rather than a person, as if the story had already been written and all that remained was for it to play out exactly as he intended. Emma met his gaze without flinching, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, and for a fraction of a second, something almost imperceptible shifted in the air between them. Something neither the audience nor the court staff could name, but it lingered there, quiet and unresolved, as the clerk called the room to order. Voices fell silent, chairs creaked softly as people leaned forward, and the hearing began. But what no one in that room realized, not even Judge Pierce himself, was that the woman they were about to witness being cornered had already seen the pattern, had already begun connecting the pieces, and had already stepped into that courtroom not as a victim, but as someone who understood exactly how fragile power becomes when it is forced to face the truth. And as the first words were spoken, the room held its breath, unaware that it was about to witness something far beyond a simple case, something that would not end the way anyone expected, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of control began to shift. The clerk's voice carried across the courtroom with practiced neutrality as she began reading the charges, each word deliberate, each phrase carefully structured to sound routine, almost mundane. Yet beneath that surface lay a narrative that had been subtly reshaped, small details altered just enough to suggest negligence, defiance, and ultimately, guilt. Emma stood still as the accusations unfolded, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression composed, though every word was being measured, tested, and quietly dismantled in her mind. Because what was being presented was not just a legal matter, it was a story, and she could already see where it had been rewritten across the room. A few spectators exchanged glances, their initial curiosity shifting toward quiet judgment, the kind that forms quickly when authority speaks with confidence. Judge Pierce leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Emma as if observing a predictable outcome, the kind he had overseen countless times before. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the case, emphasizing Emma's alleged failure to comply with a court directive, presenting documents that appeared official, stamped, and indisputable. Yet as each page was referenced, Emma's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly because she recognized the formatting, the language, the subtle inconsistencies in phrasing that did not align with standard procedural notices. It was not obvious to anyone else, not to the audience, not even to the prosecutor who seemed confident in the material he had been handed, but to Emma. It was enough to raise a quiet alarm, a signal that something beneath the surface had been constructed rather than documented. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. The room remained focused on the narrative being built against her, the prosecutor's voice steady, methodical, reinforcing the idea that this was a simple matter of accountability, that Emma had ignored a lawful summons and now faced the consequences. A few people in the back row nodded subtly, their perception already shaped by the structure of the argument. Because in a courtroom, repetition often becomes truth, and confidence often becomes credibility. Judge Pierce allowed the presentation to continue without interruption, occasionally making brief notes, though his attention seemed less on the details and more on the rhythm of the proceedings, as if he were ensuring that everything unfolded according to an internal script. Emma shifted slightly, opening her folder with quiet precision, revealing neatly organized documents, each page aligned, each tab placed with intention, but she did not reach for them yet. Instead, she listened, absorbing every statement, every claim, allowing the full weight of the accusations to settle in the room before she responded. Because timing, she understood, was as critical as truth, the prosecutor concluded with a measured tone, suggesting that the evidence clearly demonstrated Emma's failure to meet her legal obligations, and that the court should consider appropriate penalties. The words hung in the air for a moment, creating a brief silence that felt heavier than expected. Judge Pierce nodded once, his expression unchanged as he turned his attention toward Emma, the invitation to respond unspoken but unmistakable. All eyes shifted to her, some expectant, others dismissive, waiting to see how a simple schoolteacher would attempt to navigate a situation that had already been framed with such certainty. Emma rose slowly, her movements calm, deliberate. Her voice when she spoke was soft, but carried clearly through the room, not rushed, not defensive, but measured in a way that immediately disrupted the pace that had been set against her. She began not with denial, but with a question, a single, precise question directed at the foundation of the case itself. And in that moment, something subtle shifted, something that could not yet be named, but was felt, a slight hesitation in the air, a pause in the confidence that had filled the room moments earlier, because the narrative, so carefully constructed, had just encountered its first fracture, and though no one said it out loud, not yet, the certainty that had once felt solid began, ever so slightly, to waver. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected, simple in its wording yet precise enough to disrupt the steady rhythm that had been carefully established. Emma's voice had not risen. It had not carried any hint of confrontation, but it had landed exactly where it needed to, at the foundation of the document the prosecutor had just presented. And for a brief moment, the courtroom hesitated. The prosecutor blinked, glancing down at the file in his hands as if confirming something he had not anticipated needing to confirm. Judge Pierce's expression remained composed, but his fingers, resting lightly against the arm of his chair, stilled just slightly, a pause so subtle that no one in the audience would notice. Yet it was there. Emma did not move from where she stood, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady. She allowed the silence to stretch just enough to become uncomfortable, not for herself, but for those who had spoken before her. because silence, she understood, had a way of revealing cracks that words could conceal. The prosecutor cleared his throat and responded, offering a general explanation, referencing standard procedures, speaking in terms that sounded authoritative but lacked specificity. And as he spoke, Emma listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, though. Inside, each response was being weighed against what she knew to be true, because the issue was not whether the document existed, but whether it had been issued in the manner claimed, and that distinction, subtle as it was, would change everything. She nodded once, as if acknowledging his answer, then asked another question, this time more focused, directing attention to a detail within the document that most would overlook. The formatting of the notice, the sequence of the case number, the timestamp that did not align with standard filing protocols. Again, her tone remained calm, almost conversational, yet the effect was immediate. The prosecutor hesitated longer this time, flipping through the pages, his earlier confidence beginning to thin, not dramatically, not enough for the audience to fully grasp, but enough for those paying close attention to sense that something was shifting. A murmur barely formed in the back of the room before quickly fading. Judge Pierce leaned forward, slightly now, his gaze narrowing just enough to suggest increased attention. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, measured, reminding the courtroom to remain focused on the relevant facts. Yet even in that reminder, there was an undercurrent, something firmer than before, as if he were attempting to guide the direction back to familiar ground. Emma acknowledged him with a slight nod, respectful, composed, but she did not step back. Instead, she reached into her folder and carefully removed a document of her own, placing it on the table before her. She did not present it immediately. She did not rush to reveal anything. Instead, she asked one more question, this one directed not at the prosecutor, but at the process itself, at the chain of custody for the notice that had been entered into evidence. And this time, the hesitation was no longer subtle. The prosecutor's response faltered, his words less certain, his eyes briefly shifting toward the bench as if seeking reassurance. And, in that moment, something changed, not in volume, not in visible reaction, but in the atmosphere of the room. The quiet assumption of certainty that had filled the space at the beginning of the hearing began to loosen, almost imperceptibly, like a thread being pulled from fabric. Emma finally lifted her document, holding it with steady hands, her voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a quiet clarity that drew every eye toward her. And as she began to speak again, not defensively, not emotionally, but with precise intention, the courtroom leaned in without realizing it, because what had started as a routine case was no longer following its expected path, and somewhere beneath the surface, the carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel, one detail at a time, while the man who had believed himself in control watched the first signs of a story slipping beyond his reach, even if he was not yet ready to admit it. And in that growing silence, the balance continued to shift. Emma placed the document down on the table with a quiet precision that drew every eye toward it, not because of what it was at first glance, but because of the calm certainty with which she handled it, as if she already knew exactly what it would reveal and when. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge before she gently turned it so it faced the bench, her voice steady as she began to explain, not with urgency, not with defensiveness, but with the kind of clarity that comes from understanding every detail long before the moment arrives. She directed attention to the header first, the official formatting, the insignia, all of which appeared correct to the untrained eye, but then she paused, just long enough for the room to lean in again, and pointed out a sequence number, a small string of digits that most would ignore, yet within that sequence was a discrepancy, a numbering pattern that did not align with filings from that court on that specific date. She did not raise her voice, she did not accuse, she simply stated the inconsistency and allowed it to exist in the open. The prosecutor shifted slightly, glancing again at his own copy, his earlier confidence now replaced by something less defined, something closer to uncertainty. Judge Pierce remained still, though his gaze sharpened, his attention no longer passive. Emma continued, moving to the timestamp printed along the margin, explaining calmly how official notices from that court followed a standardized time logging system, one that did not match what was presented in the document entered into evidence. She spoke as if she were guiding a class through a lesson, patient, precise, never rushing, never forcing the conclusion, because she understood that the strongest arguments were not declared, they were revealed. One step at a time, the room grew quieter with each detail, the earlier murmurs replaced by a focused stillness. Even the subtle sounds of papers shifting and chairs creaking seemed to fade, as if the space itself was narrowing around the exchange unfolding at the center. The prosecutor attempted to respond, offering a brief explanation about clerical variations, about possible administrative inconsistencies, but the words lacked the firmness they carried before, and as he spoke, Emma did not interrupt. She listened, her expression unchanged, then gently reached for another page in her folder, placing it beside the first, aligning them carefully so both were visible. This second document, she explained, was a certified notice from the same court, issued within the same week, its formatting identical in structure but different in the details she had just highlighted. The sequence number followed the expected pattern, the timestamp aligned with the official logging system, and when placed side by side, the contrast became undeniable. She did not need to say the word discrepancy again. It was already present, visible, undeniable in its quiet clarity. A subtle shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but real. A few heads tilted slightly, a few brows furrowed as the audience began to process what they were seeing. Judge Pierce leaned forward now, his posture no longer relaxed. His voice when he spoke was controlled but firmer, asking Emma how she had obtained the comparison document, the question framed as procedural, yet carrying an undercurrent of challenge. Emma met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, direct, explaining that it was publicly accessible through court records, available to anyone who knew where to look. Her tone remained respectful, but there was a quiet confidence beneath it, the kind that does not need to assert itself, because it is already evident. The prosecutor fell silent for a moment, his earlier narrative no longer flowing as smoothly, the structure he had relied on beginning to weaken under the weight of details he had not anticipated needing to defend. And in that moment, the courtroom felt different, not because of any dramatic declaration, but because of a subtle realization that had begun to take hold. The case that once seemed straightforward was no longer as clear as it had been presented, and the woman who had been expected to stand quietly at the center of it was now guiding the direction of the room, with nothing more than careful observation and measured words, while the man who believed he controlled the outcome sat watching as the certainty he had built started to shift, piece by piece, into something far less predictable. The silence that followed did not break immediately. It stretched across the room in a way that felt unfamiliar for a space usually governed by certainty and control, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion alone, but from the slow realization that something foundational has shifted. Emma did not rush to fill it. She allowed it to exist, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, because she understood that this moment, this quiet pause, carried more weight than any argument she could force into it. Across from her, the prosecutor adjusted his stance, flipping through his documents again. Though now his movements lacked the earlier precision, his confidence no longer anchored in the same certainty, he began to speak, attempting to reframe the issue, suggesting that minor discrepancies did not invalidate the overall legitimacy of the notice. His voice steady but carrying an undertone of urgency that had not been there before, as if trying to regain control of a narrative that was slowly slipping away. Emma listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her expression neutral, but when he finished, she responded with a quiet clarity that cut through the room more effectively than volume ever could. She acknowledged his point, not dismissing it, but then gently redirected the focus, explaining that the issue was not about minor clerical differences, but about procedural integrity, about whether a document that initiated legal action had been generated and recorded within the established system of the court. And as she spoke, she reached once more into her folder, retrieving a smaller, less noticeable sheet. Placing it beside the others with the same deliberate care, she did not present it immediately. Instead, she asked a question. Simple, direct, directed not just at the prosecutor, but at the process itself, asking whether the court could confirm the origin log of the notice in question, whether there existed a corresponding entry within the official filing database that matched the sequence number and timestamp provided. The question lingered, and this time, there was no immediate response. The prosecutor hesitated, his eyes moving briefly toward the clerk, then back to his file, and in that hesitation, something became visible to everyone present, not as a statement, but as a feeling. The certainty that had once filled the room was now fractured. Judge Pierce shifted slightly in his seat, his posture more rigid now, his gaze fixed more intently on Emma, as if attempting to anticipate her next move rather than direct it. Emma then lifted the smaller sheet she had placed down moments earlier, holding it with the same steady composure, and explained that it was a certified extract from the court's own digital filing system, obtained through public records, showing all notices issued within the relevant time frame. Her voice remained calm, measured, but each word carried a precision that left little room for misinterpretation. She pointed to the entries, guiding attention to the absence rather than the presence, to the fact that while numerous notices had been logged correctly, following the expected sequence and timing, the specific notice presented against her did not appear anywhere within that system. She did not accuse, she did not dramatize, she simply allowed the absence to speak for itself. And in that moment, the effect was undeniable. A subtle shift moved through the audience, a quiet intake of breath, a shared recognition that something was not aligning as it should. The prosecutor remained still, his earlier attempts to respond now replaced by silence. His eyes fixed on the document, as if searching for an explanation that was no longer readily available. Judge Pierce's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, his control no longer absolute. His voice, when he finally spoke, measured but firmer, asking for clarification, though the question itself seemed less about understanding and more about regaining footing. Emma met his gaze once more, her answer simple, respectful, but unwavering, explaining that if the notice had not been properly logged, then its legitimacy, its very existence as an official court directive, came into question. And as her words settled into the room, the silence returned, heavier now, no longer neutral, but charged with the quiet realization that the structure of the case, so carefully presented at the beginning, was no longer holding together as it once had. And in that stillness, the balance shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, as control began to move away from the one who had assumed it was his from the start. For the first time since the hearing began, the authority in the room did not feel absolute. It felt questioned, and that difference, subtle yet undeniable, settled over every person present like a quiet pressure that no one could ignore. Emma remained standing, her posture unchanged, her presence calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension now building beneath the surface. She did not rush forward. She did not press aggressively. Instead, she allowed the weight of what had already been revealed to settle fully into the room, because she understood that truth, when given space, often speaks louder than force. Across the bench, Judge Pierce's gaze remained fixed on her, but there was something different now, something less certain, his earlier composure still intact, but no longer effortless, as if maintaining it required a level of focus he had not anticipated needing. The prosecutor shifted again, his movements more deliberate now, as though each action required careful consideration rather than routine confidence. He attempted to respond once more, suggesting that the absence of a digital record could be attributed to system delays or administrative backlog. His words structured, but lacking the steady conviction they once carried. Emma listened, her eyes steady, her expression neutral, and when he finished, she did not contradict him directly. Instead, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the possibility, and then, with the same quiet precision that had guided her throughout, she asked another question, one that did not challenge the explanation itself, but examined its implications. She asked whether such a delay or backlog would affect only a single notice, or whether it would appear consistently across multiple filings within the same time frame. The question lingered, simple in form, yet impossible to dismiss without consequence. The prosecutor hesitated, longer this time, his eyes shifting briefly toward the clerk, who remained still, her hands resting on the desk, her silence more telling than any response she could have offered. The room grew quieter, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. As though everyone present was now fully aware that something significant was unfolding, Emma then reached once more into her folder, retrieving a final document, one that appeared less formal than the others, its edges slightly worn, but its content carefully preserved. She placed it gently on the table, turning it toward the bench, her voice steady as she explained that it was a confirmation receipt from the court's electronic notification system, showing the exact notices that had been successfully processed and delivered during the period in question. She pointed to the entries, guiding attention not just to what was present, but to what was consistent. Every notice followed the same pattern, the same sequence, the same timestamp structure, without deviation, and once again, the absence of the notice presented against her became more than just a discrepancy. It became a pattern of inconsistency that could no longer be explained as coincidence. The prosecutor remained silent. Now, his earlier attempts to reframe the situation no longer sufficient to counter the clarity of what was being revealed. Judge Pierce leaned back slightly, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper, more focused, as if recalculating the direction of the proceedings in real time. Emma did not look away, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted further, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through the quiet accumulation of undeniable details, each one placed carefully, each one revealing a little more of what had been hidden beneath the surface. And as the silence returned once again, it no longer felt uncertain, it felt charged, as if the truth, once uncovered, was now moving forward on its own, beyond the control of anyone who had tried to contain it. And for the first time, it became clear that what had begun as an attempt to corner one woman was turning into something far more dangerous for the man who had set it in motion, even if he had not yet fully realized it. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a space suspended between two realities, one carefully constructed and now beginning to fracture, and another emerging quietly through the precision of a woman who had not raised her voice once. Emma stood exactly where she had been, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her had shifted. The prosecutor remained silent, his earlier arguments now reduced to scattered fragments that no longer formed a coherent narrative. The clerk's eyes moved between the documents on the table and the bench, her stillness now carrying a different weight, as if she too recognized that something beyond routine procedure was unfolding. Judge Pierce sat upright, his hands now resting firmly on the armrests, his composed expression intact, but no longer effortless. There was a tension beneath it now, subtle but present, the kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways that cannot be openly acknowledged. Emma did not press forward immediately. She allowed the silence to settle once more, her gaze steady, her posture calm, because she understood that this was the moment where clarity did not need to be forced, it needed to be seen. And then, with the same measured tone that had guided every word she had spoken, she took one final step forward, not physically, but in the direction of the truth itself. She spoke not of assumptions, not of accusations, but of process, of how every official action within the court followed a chain, a sequence that ensured accountability, and how when that chain was broken, even in the smallest detail, it called into question not just a single document, but the integrity of the action itself. Her words were not dramatic, they were precise, almost instructional, yet each one landed with increasing weight, because they were no longer just observations, they were conclusions drawn from undeniable patterns. She then turned her attention gently back to the bench, her voice steady, respectful, but carrying a quiet firmness that had not been present before. She asked whether the court could confirm, with absolute certainty, that the notice in question had been generated, logged, and delivered through the official system without deviation. The question did not echo loudly, but it filled the room completely, and for the first time, there was no immediate response. Judge Pierce's gaze remained fixed on her, but there was a pause, a hesitation that had not existed before, his authority still present, but now accompanied by something else, something closer to calculation, as if he were weighing not just the question, but the implications of answering it. The room held its breath, no one moved, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to tighten, and in that stillness, the shift became undeniable, because the power that had once dictated the direction of the room was now being asked to justify itself. Emma did not look away, her eyes steady, her expression composed. She did not need to say more. She did not need to push further, because the question itself had already done what it needed to do. It had exposed the space where certainty should have existed but did not, and in that space, doubt began to take form, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, persistently, the kind of doubt that cannot be dismissed once it has been seen. The prosecutor remained still, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by silence. The clerk's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her desk, and somewhere in the back of the room, a faint shift of weight broke the stillness for just a moment before it returned again, heavier now, more charged, and as Judge Pierce finally leaned forward, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper than before, it became clear to everyone present that the hearing had moved beyond anything that had been planned, because what had begun as an attempt to control a narrative was now forcing the very authority behind it to stand and answer for itself. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture, the balance of the room completed its shift, leaving only one question remaining, not about Emma, but about the system that had tried to define her, and whether it could withstand the truth that was now impossible to ignore. The pause that followed was no longer uncertain. It was decisive, the kind of silence that does not ask what happens next, but waits to witness it. Judge Pierce leaned forward, his voice measured as he began to respond, carefully choosing each word, framing his answer within the boundaries of procedure, suggesting that while the court maintained strict protocols, there could be rare instances of irregularities that did not necessarily invalidate a notice. His tone was controlled, authoritative. Yet beneath it there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, as if he were no longer guiding the direction of the room but attempting to contain it. Emma listened without interruption, her expression calm, her posture steady, and when he finished, she did not challenge him directly. She did not contradict his authority. Instead, she nodded slightly, acknowledging his statement, and then, with the same quiet precision that had carried her this far, she took the final step. She spoke not louder, not faster, but with a clarity that drew every eye toward her. She explained that she had anticipated the possibility of such an explanation, that procedural flexibility could be cited when convenient, and for that reason, she had taken an additional step before arriving at the courtroom that morning. She reached into her folder once more, retrieving a sealed envelope, its surface marked with an official insignia. She placed it gently on the table, her fingers resting on it for just a moment before she slid it forward, her voice steady as she explained that the document inside was not obtained through public access, but through a formal records request submitted weeks earlier, a request for a complete audit trail of all notices generated under the specific case number referenced in the proceedings. The room leaned in without realizing it, the air tightening as attention focused. On the envelope, Emma opened it carefully, removing a certified report, its pages marked, signed, and sealed. She placed it beside the other documents, aligning it with the same deliberate care, and then she began to speak, guiding the room through its contents step by step. The report detailed every action associated with the case number, every entry, every modification, every access point within the system. And as she spoke, it became clear that there was no record of the notice being generated through the official system at all, not delayed, not misfiled, not pending, simply absent. The words settled into the room with a weight that could not be redirected. The prosecutor remained still, his earlier attempts to respond now completely silent. The clerk's posture stiffened slightly, her eyes fixed on the report, and Judge Pierce, for the first time, did not immediately speak. His gaze moved from the document to Emma, then back again, as if recalculating something that no longer aligned with expectation. Emma did not stop there. She turned one final page, her voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a quiet finality. She pointed to a section of the report that documented unauthorized access attempts within the system, entries that did not follow standard authentication procedures, timestamps that existed without corresponding authorization logs. She did not accuse. She did not assign blame. She simply presented the pattern, allowing it to exist in the open, undeniable in its implication. The room fell completely silent, not a shifting chair, Not a whispered word. Nothing. The kind of silence that follows when truth is no longer a possibility but a presence. Judge Pierce's expression remained composed, but the effort to maintain it was now visible, his authority still intact in form, but no longer unquestioned in substance. Emma stood quietly, her hands resting at her sides, her gaze steady. She had not raised her voice. She had not made a single accusation, and yet everything had changed. The narrative that had once been certain was now exposed as incomplete, unstable, and the man who had believed himself to be the architect of the outcome now sat within it, no longer above it. And in that stillness, the shift was complete, not announced, not declared, but understood by every person in the room as the truth. Once hidden behind procedure and authority, now stood in plain sight, leaving no room for interpretation, only the quiet, undeniable weight of what had been revealed. No one spoke, not immediately, because the moment did not belong to words anymore. It belonged to realization, the kind that settles slowly but completely, filling every corner of the room with a weight that could not be ignored. Emma remained standing where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had simply completed what needed to be done, not as a performance, not as a victory, but as a correction. Across the bench, Judge Pierce sat still, his gaze fixed on the documents before him. The carefully structured authority he had carried into the room now quiet, no longer asserted, no longer reinforced, but held in a fragile balance that everyone present could feel. The prosecutor lowered his eyes, his earlier presence reduced to silence. The clerk remained motionless, her hands resting on the desk, her attention fixed forward, as if waiting for something that had already arrived. And then, after what felt longer than it truly was, Judge Pierce spoke, his voice measured, controlled, but different now, stripped of the certainty that had defined it at the beginning. He acknowledged the inconsistencies, not with resistance, not with denial, but with careful neutrality, stating that the matter required further review, that the integrity of the process must be upheld. His words formal, procedural, yet beneath them was something unmistakable, an absence of dominance, an absence of the quiet superiority that had once framed every sentence he delivered. The courtroom remained silent as he continued, ordering that the case be dismissed pending investigation into the discrepancies presented. The words landed softly, but their impact carried through the room like a shift in gravity. Emma did not react outwardly. She did not smile. She did not move. She simply listened, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. Because this had never been about reaction. It had been about truth, and truth, once established, did not require celebration. It required recognition. A faint movement rippled through the audience, not applause, not noise, but a subtle shift of understanding, of perspective, as those who had entered the room expecting one outcome now found themselves witnessing another, something quieter, yet far more powerful. Judge Pierce closed the file in front of him, the sound soft against the polished surface, yet it carried a finality that echoed far beyond the gesture itself. He did not look at Emma again, not immediately, as if the space between them now held more than either of them needed to acknowledge directly. Emma gathered her documents with the same care she had shown throughout, aligning each page, placing them back into her folder with quiet precision, her movements unhurried, unshaken, as if the weight of the room had never pressed against her at all. And as she turned to leave, her steps measured against the marble floor. The room remained silent, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because something had been revealed that could not be undone, not just about the case, not just about the documents, but about the nature of authority itself, about how easily it can be misused when it goes unquestioned, and how fragile it becomes when it is forced to stand against truth. Emma reached the doors without looking back, her hand resting briefly against the handle, before she stepped out into the light beyond. And behind her, the courtroom remained still, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it had just been reminded of something it had nearly forgotten. That respect is not commanded by position, it is earned through integrity, and that on that day, in that quiet, measured exchange, the room had witnessed exactly what that looks like.